Beautiful sunrise over the Rocky Mountains in Denver, Colorado, the greatest city in the known universe. So I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop, aka the boardroom. A little while back I was contacted by some customers of mine and they were interested in having me build some wainscoting. These 4 JPEGs represent the 4 walls that make up their formal dining room. And this square pattern was what we came up with after a few meetings, a few phone calls, and a couple of different designs in SketchUp. Overall, I was pretty excited about the project. I was really looking forward to a modern take on a more traditional woodworking project. To put this project in perspective a little bit, the panels are going to be a little over 6 feet tall, and the ceiling height I think is about 11 feet. And I had planned to build the panels as large monolithic structures that could then be delivered and attached to the wall. The reason I wanted to do that was to keep quality high. If I decided to build this on site, there's no way I could have built it to the tolerances that I can when I'm in my shop. When doing my research for this project, I'd seen that a few other people had constructed similar patterns, and on each of the versions that I saw, there was always something that bugged me about the way that it was built. For example, attaching the squares directly to drywall without putting any sheeting up. And to me, going that route wouldn't have looked as high-end and professional as I was hoping for. It would have had more of a DIY feel. I am fortunate to have a nice sized shop, but it can be a little bit of a hike to get from my joiner over to my planer. Hey, wait a second, was that a joke? So with the design finalized and the construction method agreed upon, it was time to get to work. So I called up my supplier and ordered 200 board feet of 4/4 rough poplar and 12 sheets of 1/4 inch MDF. Here's a trick that I use to come back to a particular setting on my planer. I've got these pre-cut blocks. This one happens to be 3/4 of an inch. I do that because I don't mill up all the lumber at one time. I sort of mill up smaller amounts just so I don't mill too much and waste lumber. Changing out the gears on my power feeder. I use a power feeder on my table saw when I've got a few hundred parts to cut out, like in this particular project. Otherwise your hands just get too tired working at the table saw for 10 straight hours. And this setup works great. Absolutely no burn marks, and your hands are a mile away from the blade. Absolutely essential item for me is a good robust stop block on your chop saw setup. I think this is an absolute must if you want to make good consistent parts. A table saw and sled would work just as good, probably better, but definitely not as fast. The plan was to construct the individual squares very much like how I would make a face frame for a cabinet, and that's with pocket hole joinery. Here's one of my favorite little tricks. This is a sanding disc called Edge Tech. And really all it is an aluminum disc that's slightly cone shaped that has some sandpaper attached to it, and you lean it over 2 degrees towards the fence and it gives you a perfectly square, perfectly sanded edge on your workpiece. Talk about moneymaker, I use this on just about every cabinet and millwork project that I do. Not so much for fine furniture, but for cabinet and millwork it's perfect. I keep a few of these things laying around the shop with different grits on them too. I think I've got an 80 grit, a 120 grit, and a 180 grit maybe. And that gets you a pretty nice finished edge. So for this project, every part went through on both sides. And just as a bonus tip, this sanding disc works pretty good on MDF end grain. So if you find yourself in a situation where you need to paint some MDF end grain, this sanding disc will really get you close to a finish ready edge. So with all the parts prepped, sanded, pocket holed, it's time to start assembling the actual squares. You can see the pile building up in the left side of the screen. So in my cabinet making I do use pocket holes quite a bit, and my solution to kind of coming up with a quick clamping method is just to have a little bit of an overhang on my workbench where I can just clamp the 2 workpieces together down to the workbench. I've tried plenty of other methods, including all the fancy clamps as well as face frame table, and I just seem to prefer this method. So with the squares all built, I wanted to make sure that the end grain was really finely sanded. I didn't want that to show through during paint, so I took everything back to the Edge Tech and cleaned it up. So if you can remember back to the original design, it's 2 squares on top of each other, and this was the process to attach those 2 squares to each other. And as you can see, some of the squares aren't quite square, they're more rectangle, and that's just based off of how much space we had on each wall. So if you see something in this video that you like, or something that maybe I skipped over a little too quickly, let me know in the comment section, and I'd be happy to put together some more specific videos on some of these techniques. If you're wondering what I'm listening to in the earbuds that I'm wearing, I got 3 words: Shop Talk Live, the greatest podcast ever. Here's a nice artsy shot of the vertical pieces all built. So once the innards of the pattern were all built, I started working on the large exterior kind of perimeter frames. Just to give a frame of reference, my workbench is 4 feet by 8 feet, so these things are pretty big. So there are a few narrow wall sections that weren't wide enough for a square or even a narrow rectangle. So this was the solution to that problem. And actually, this was at the direction of the customer. I just wanted to put a flat piece in there, and I think in the end this was really the right decision. And it just goes to show you the collaboration between, maker and customer is really a great thing. This is a good shot of the narrow piece coming together, and just picked up the top and bottom line of each of the squares. So with all the narrow pieces done and all the perimeter frames built, it was time to start filling in the guts, so to speak. Pieces that spaced the squares apart vertically were all identical in length, but the pieces that spaced the squares sort of left to right were all a little bit different because each of the walls was just slightly different. So again, more pocket holes to hold all this together. I'm using that little block just to make sure I get the piece located properly. Clamping all these was a little bit interesting. In a case like this, just failure is not an option, and you just got to use what you have at hand to get it done. One of the things I liked most about this project was that I feel like this design is fairly uncharted territory. I mean, I think there's plenty of pictures and tutorials on how to put up standard shaker wainscoting, but it really is fun to work on a kind of a new design, something that's a little bit more cutting edge. It can be a little scary too. You spend quite a bit of money and on materials and a lot of time building this thing, and on delivery day you really, really hope the customer's happy. Moving on to rough cutting the backs. This is just good old-fashioned 1/4-inch MDF. I must say it's a delight to use a sliding table saw to cut sheet goods. I had a vertical panel saw before this one, a Holzer model, and ended up blowing out my shoulder lifting the panels on and off the saw. With this, it's just pick up one side and then pick up the other. Couldn't be easier. So I always think about the steps ahead as I'm building something, and finishing is really should be a big concern through the course of an entire project. And I was worried about how I would conceal the line where 2 of the back panels butt jointed, and this was my solution, was that I was going to hide all the butt joints. The process was pretty easy. It was a little tedious, but basically just draw where the panel is on the piece and then make some notches, kind of create a little bit of a puzzle. If I may toot my own horn a little bit, this is one of the little details that separates the weekend warriors from the true professionals. God, you can see how windy it is in my shop. I think it was super windy that day. That's my dust collection, is just to have the garage doors open. This is a little detail that's not real super hard to do, but it does take time, and I think if you're building this for your own house or you're a hobbyist, you can do that, but it is tough to justify this when you're trying to make money building projects like this. But, that's just something that I force myself to do. And so far, I've been pretty lucky to find customers who are interested in having projects like this built to a little bit of a higher standard. There it is, the puzzle's coming together. So at this point, I'd been moving these things around the shop for a couple of days and was kind of getting a real sense of how big and unwieldy they were. So I decided when I was going to put the backs on, I wanted to add quite a bit of strength. I put a ton of glue and a ton of nails. But I was also very careful to avoid any squeeze out and certainly no nail blowouts. Whistling a happy tune. I'm almost as good of a whistler as Yondu from Guardians of the Galaxy. At some point during the assembly of these panels, you'll see me change nail guns, and that's because after about 18 years and probably 30,000 nails, this nail gun said, "No more!" And it gave up the ghost. Died a glorious death, but, that's that. And I will say that the cheap you-know-what in me started to come out, and I started taking the nail gun apart to try and fix it. And then the level-headed businessman in me said, you know what, your time is better spent shooting nails rather than fixing nail guns, so I decided to just go buy a new nail gun. Nice little foot action there. So here's your first real shot of the panel after assembly. Too bad I'm blocking the view. There's the new nail gun sitting there. This is its maiden voyage. So because I just laid the back on, I needed to kind of fill in the space on the exposed edges there. And this is what I came up with. I just milled up a 1/4-inch piece and nail and glued it in place. The best way to care for your delicate Japanese hand saws is to cut through wet wood glue. You might be wondering why I'm not cleaning up this edge with that table saw sanding disc, and ultimately the reason is, this would be the only panel that I'd be able to put through. The others were just too big. And yes, I chose a hand plane over a router or a lipping planer or anything else. So during assembly I was unable to get glue on every single one of the joints, so I decided to come back with thin 2P10 super glue and of course the accelerator to kind of just close up those joints a little bit and help prevent any cracking that may occur in the future in the paint. So speaking of paint, anytime you're going to have something white painted, prep is absolutely everything. And though the materials are a little bit cheaper on paint grade projects, there's definitely more prep work. Gratuitous glamour shot of my admirable Ford Econoline van. So anytime I'm using MDF, I like to use a non-water-based primer. This happens to be a shellac-based primer, which is obviously soluble in denatured alcohol. And denatured alcohol will raise the grain a little bit, but it's not too bad. After the first coat of primer, the real sanding begins. All the inside edges, corners, easing everything off. I like to really do a good prep so that the painter can come in and just spray and do his job. When did it become the mentality of carpenters to, think that, oh, well, the painter will take care of my crappy work, and that's just not how I operate. I've heard carpenters make jokes after leaving gaps in crown moldings that, hey, that's the painter's job. During most of the sanding and priming of this project, I was listening to the actor Bill Nye read George Orwell's Animal Farm, and boy, what a blast back to high school that was. But it's a good book, and it's funny how your tastes and opinions and all that change as you get older. So after sanding, I laid on a good thick coat of primer, and I really focused on the inside corners to make sure that there were no gaps between the MDF and the actual square pattern. So I let it dry for a day, and then it was ready for delivery. Here are a couple of shots of the installation process. And I added a 1 by 1.5 as a picture rail to top it off, and then I just matched the base molding of the rest of the house. Overall, I was pretty happy with how this turned out. It was a really fun project, and I think the customer was really happy as well. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, let me know. I'd welcome the feedback. Close it out here with my personal favorite picture of the project. Thanks for watching. Till next time.